Fella sitting in a bar one day and he had his drink in front of him and he's sitting there and he's all depressed. He's the only one in the bar and he's sitting there. Just completely depressed. Next thing, the door opened and this big truck driver came in, 6'8". Looked around the bar, nobody there, went over to your man, saw that he was depressed, and the truck driver thought he'd livened the whole place up. So he went over and he reached for your man's drink, grabbed it, drank it down in one slug and put the glass back in the counter and slapped your man on the back to see what sort of reaction he'd get. And your man started to cry. And the truck driver then, he sort of took pity on him and he said, listen, I'm very sorry. He says, I apologise. I was only trying to bring a bit of life and humour here, he says. And he says, I'll buy you another drink, he said. And your man looked at the truck driver, he says, well, you needn't bother, he says, buy me another drink. He says, the truck says, what's wrong with you? He says, don't talk to me. Don't talk to me. He said, I got up this morning. He says, I was late getting up. He says, I was late getting into work. And because I was late getting into work, he says, I fell out with the boss. He said, with a big row. And the boss sacked me. He says, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he says, I left the work. I went out. I was going to go home. He says, and when I went out, somebody stole my car. He says, and he says, I thought things wouldn't get any worse, so I got a taxi home. And I just got out of the taxi and the taxi was disappearing down the end of the street. And I realised I'd left my wallet in the back of the taxi. I went into the house, he says, and I thought things couldn't get any worse. And when I went into the house, he says, I found my wife in bed with the next door neighbour. So I come down here, he says. I'm sitting here on my own, he says, and I'm thinking about ending it all. He says, I'm thinking of doing away with myself. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, he says, you come in and drink the poison. This plane was in Dublin. It was ready to take off to go to New York. The passengers had come on, and one of the passengers had come on and saw the lovely leather seats in first class and sat down. And the steward went over and said, can I see your ticket? And he showed him the ticket. The ticket was for economy. He says, I'm very sorry, sir. He says, you can't sit there. He says, your ticket is economy. This is first class. The passenger said, carry on. He said, I'm sitting here, great seat. I'm sitting here, bless you, that's great, you know. The man said, no, you can't. You're in economy, he says. This is first class. And he wouldn't get up. So the captain came on and he spotted the argument and he called the steward over. He said, what seems to be the problem over there? And the steward says, well, that passenger, he says, he's from Kerry and he's sitting in first class, but his ticket is economy and he won't get up and move for me. The captain says, not at all. I'll deal with this. The captain went over and he whispered in your man's ear. Your man shot up, grabbed his bag and ran back to economy. And the steward said to the captain, he says, whatever did you say to him, sir? The captain says, I just informed that first class wasn't going to New York. This other flight was on its way to New York. It had been in the air 7 hours. And the captain had called the stewardess in to say they were just about to land. So the stewardess, and she was gorgeous. It was her first time on the plane. The captain had never met her. And the stewardess, she went off down to the back of the plane. And the captain then switched on his radio and said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with our airline. We'll be shortly arriving in Kennedy Airport, New York. And please fasten your seatbelts and we'll be prepared for arrival and hope you fly with us again. Thank you very much. And he thought he switched off the radio, but he hadn't. And it was still on, and he turned around to the co-pilot. He says, and do you know what I'm going to do? He says, whenever I get to New York, he says, I go down the town, he says, I'm going to drink 5 or 6 pints. He says, and the next thing, he says, I'm going to take that new stewardess to bed for the evening. And this came over the radio. So the stewardess, she heard it. She ran the whole way up the length of the plane. As she was running up, there was somebody's handbag lying in the middle aisle. She tripped over that and landed on her mouth and nose beside this little old lady of about 87. And the little old lady leaned over and she tapped the stewardess. She says, you needn't be in any hurry, love, for I heard him saying he was going to have a few drinks first. This man was out shopping with his wife one day and the two of them were shopping around the town and the next thing the man felt he had to go to the toilet. So he went into the public toilets and he went into a cubicle and he sat down and he just sat down and was preparing to do what he was going to do. And the next thing the fella in the next cubicle, he could hear him saying, well, how's it going there? And the man sort of looked up a wee bit and he says, not so bad, it's all right, yeah. He says, the man in the next cubicle says, it's a grand spot of weather, isn't it? And the boy says, yeah, but it's fair enough, wee bit of rain there yesterday, but it's not so bad, you know. He says, so the voice on the other side said, well, what are you at today anyway? Well, I'm down doing a bit of shopping with the wife, he says, and I just felt that I had to go to the toilet. And the next thing he heard the voice in another cubicle saying, listen, Harry, I'll call you back. There's some idiot in the next cubicle. He says, keeps interrupting us. these two lads, and they weren't well. They were in a mental hospital for years, and one of them disappeared, and his mate, after about a week, couldn't figure out where he went. So he went up to the boss man. He says, "Where did my friend go?" The boss man says, "He's released. He's gone." He says, "What do you mean he's released?" He says, "I never heard anything about it." Well, we felt maybe it was time for him, to get back into society, so we gave him a little test and we released him. So the man said, "Well, look, I'm here the same length of time as him." He says, maybe I should do the test and release me. Well, says the boss, "Well, come up to the office," he says, "and I'll give you the test." He says, so we're up to the office. It's a very simple test. Now, he says, only 3 questions, and you don't have to answer them now. He says, I'll give you the same chance that your friend got. I'll give you a week to answer them. Come back to me in a week with the answers. He says, now, it's a very simple test. He says, the first question, he said, how many days in the week begin with the letter T? Right, he said, man, that's a grand question. Second question, he said, how many seconds are there in a year? Right, might take a bit of working out that now. And the third question is, how many D's are there in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? "Ah, no, that'll take me a week, all right," he said, So anyway, come back the following Friday. He says to the boss, he says, "Have them 3 questions." He says, the boss is right. He says, what's the first one? He says, how many days of the week begin with the letter T? And your man says, 4. So what do you mean 4? He said, well, there's Tuesday, Thursday, today and tomorrow. So the man says, well, technically you're wrong, but I suppose you're right. So he says, I can't fault you on that. You're using the brain. The second question, he says, how many seconds are there in the year? Well, he says, that took me a while. He says, it's a trick question. He says, I knew it. He says, 12. Ah, no, he says, how'd you make that out? Well, he says, there's January the 2nd, February the 2nd, March the 2nd. Well, technically, again, you're wrong, but he says, I'll give you full marks for that now. He says, you're winning so far. Now, he says, the last question, he says, how many D's are there in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? Now, he says, that was the one that took me all week. He says, 257. Well, how'd you work that out? Well, he said, it took me a while, but it's dee 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 dee. George W. Bush, and he's out visiting, campaigning, and he's gone to this nursing home, and he's going round the nursing home, and he meets this old man of 92, and he starts talking to the old man, and he realises the old man doesn't know who he is. So eventually George Bush says to me, he says, excuse me there, he says, do you know who I am? The old boy looked at me, he says, no, he says, but if you go round to the front desk, I'm sure they'll tell you. There was this old couple, and they were well in their 80s, and they went down to the doctor one day, and the two of them sat in with the doctor, and the doctor says, what seems to be the problem? Well, the man says, well, doctor, he says, I think my memory is going. He says, I think my memory's nearly gone. The doctor says, why? Well, he says, I just a lot of things I don't remember. He says, well, when did you discover this? And he says, discover what? he says, when did you discover your memory was going? He says, well, we come back from holidays. It's a couple of weeks ago. He says, well, we were away there for 2 weeks in where were we? Where in the hell were we? Now, there's a good doctor. Where were we? And he says, doctor, what do you call that stuff that grows up the outside of a house? And the doctor says, ivy. He says, that's it, doctor. And he turned around to the wife and he says, ivy, where were we in holidays 2 weeks ago?